Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of individual interviews with influential professionals and top leaders to explore the governance challenges posed by emerging approaches to climate change. I'm Ali Hassam, Outreach Officer of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Agustin Ávila Romero, a doctor in social sciences and rural development and a master in rural development from the Metropolitan Autonomous University. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and currently he serves as the General Director of Climate Action Policies at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, an acting General Director of the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change. He was the General Coordinator of the Center for Education and Training for Sustainable Development and the General Director of Productive Options at the Ministry of Welfare. Dr. Ávila, welcome to this C2GTalk, which takes place in a challenging context. We know from the IPCC that exceeding the 1.5 Celsius degrees target is now more likely than not, even in the lowest emissions pathways that reach 1.5 Celsius degrees. We also know that more than ever the priority for meeting the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement and those addressing the root cause of climate change must be emissions reduction and the removal of excess atmospheric carbon. But this context also leads some scientists to seek different ways to address the growing impacts of temperature overshoot, including techniques such as solar radiation modification, SRM. Techniques that by no means can be considered solutions to the climate crisis, but that could help temporarily reduce some of the impacts related to temperature overshoot. Dr. Ávila, to start, I wanted to ask you to tell us a bit about your work and some of the climate issues that the Mexican government is currently focusing on. What are some of the main climate change impacts in Mexico and the region, and what are the key strategies and challenges for addressing and reducing these impacts in Mexico and the region? Hello, Alia. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today. Our work here in the Mexican government, specifically in the climate change unit, focuses on developing public policies in this field for our country. It revolves around the crucial component we have emphasized: taking climate action in the diverse regions of Mexico to effectively address the impacts of climate change. The first thing I would like to say is that Mexico is a country that contributes very little to the global greenhouse gas emissions, but is increasingly experiencing the effects of climate change. We are observing sea level rise on both coasts, in the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. And for example, we are addressing a community, the Centla Forest community in Tabasco, which is already disappearing due to rising sea levels. And due to this sea level rise, we also have extreme drought that led to a drought emergency declaration in the northern part of the country last year. Alongside that, we have landslides and flooding due to heavy rains, as well as the arrival of hurricanes, both from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. Mexico is a country that is highly vulnerable to climate change and is increasingly feeling its impacts. As the government of Mexico, what we are doing is taking steps to reduce our emissions. And that's why at COP27, Mexico committed to increasing its climate reduction targets from 22 to 35%. But we are also progressing in building new public policy with the people regarding adaptation. It is a participatory adaptation from the people at the grassroots level, aiming to involve directly affected individuals and starting to build climate resilience strategies from there. These strategies allow strengthening local food generations through agroecological techniques instead of monoculture crops. They involve the implementation of green walls as alternatives to solely technological solutions envisioned by large companies. They enable ecological land planning based on the territory's capabilities and involve cities and municipalities as key players in this narrative, allowing them to drive the processes of confronting and resisting climate change, as we have called it here in our country. Yes, definitely a series of very important challenges for a government like yours, which is at the forefront of all the consequences of climate change. And it goes without saying a country that has a relatively small international footprint. Dr. Ávila, at the end of last year, a controversial event occurred that provoked strong reactions worldwide. A new US commercial company launched a balloon in Baja California designed to release aerosols into the stratosphere, proposing what they call a cooling credits scheme. And days after this news became public, the federal government of Mexico issued an official statement announcing the prohibition of solar radiation modification experiments. Could you tell us more about the sequence of events that led to the communication from INECC and SEMARNAT? What happened during those moments? Was the Mexican government informed about this experiment? Well, the first thing I would say is that the climate crisis we are facing requires real solutions. It does not require viewing climate change as just another green business, but what we need are real mitigation and adaptation actions on the ground. We found out that a US-based startup in Boston was conducting solar geoengineering experiments in our country without seeking any kind of permission from the federal government, state governments, or municipal governments. So the first thing we want to make clear as the government of Mexico is that we will not allow our territory to become a testing ground for any of these technologies. Second, undoubtedly, this action was carried out without the consent of the government of Mexico, violating our national sovereignty. Third, different studies indicate the potential collateral impacts of using this technology, such as generating periods of drought in some areas due to the reflection of solar rays or concentration of rainfall in the tropics. Additionally, there is the concern about the ozone layer depletion, which various scientific studies have linked to the use of this technology. Therefore, the statement was jointly signed by the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of the Government of Mexico, the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, and the National Council of Science and Technology of Mexico. The latter is crucial because it is where scientific research is conducted in our country, and it is where experts and researchers are sounding the alarm about the use of this technology and its potential impact not only on the climate but also on the sustainability of Mexican society. It could affect the rainfall cycles for agricultural production or even lead to climate-induced migration processes if rainfall ceases in certain regions and they cannot produce their food. And just to clarify one point here, is research on the topic also prohibited, or is it only the prohibition of indoor-outdoor experimentation? Everything. We will not allow research and experimentation on solar geoengineering in anywhere on our territory. It is not a priority for the government of Mexico. We believe that we need to take real mitigation actions against climate change, especially by large corporations, many of which are US companies operating on our territory. They need to make a significant effort to mitigate the greenhouse gases that are causing this climate crisis. We believe that's where we should invest in technology, substantially reducing the carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere and addressing the issue of methane production. For example, at SEMARNAT, we have implemented a new regulation on wastewater discharge in our country, aiming to substantially reduce the gases that emanate from what industrial companies are discharging into our rivers. Thank you for this clarification, Doctor. So, at the national level, what measures is the Mexican government taking or planning to take? Could you provide us with some information? We maintain close coordination with the National Council of Science and Technology. We have already held a panel of experts at the Latin American level, primarily focused on this topic. We have participated in meetings with ministers of environment and climate change offices in Iberoamerica, where we have discussed this specific situation of solar geoengineering. We have communicated the Mexican government's intention to soon announce a regulation prohibiting solar geoengineering in our country and to advance international governance on this issue and this type of experiment. In that sense, we have also spoken with the government of Germany and other countries to create international rules that prevent us from engaging in these types of experiments. We need to avoid potential strong consequences for the climate on the rest of the planet while aiming to mitigate the effects of climate change. Perfect. And in your conversations with countries like Germany, for example, or in the different multilateral spaces you mentioned, what kind of reactions have you encountered in addressing this issue? As this conversation is still very new and many countries are not well informed about it, it would be interesting to know what kind of reactions you have encountered in these conversations. Certainly, it is a very new topic internationally, and Mexico had the misfortune of being the first country in the world to have been subject to this experimentation. So, it is a new and novel issue. Other countries are eagerly awaiting the regulations that the Mexican government will announce on this matter. Undoubtedly, we will have the opportunity to develop bilateral or multilateral meetings that allow us to create and initiate an initiative in this regard, either towards COP28 or within the United Nations framework. What we believe is that we need to focus resources against climate change on genuine mitigation and adaptation actions. What we see here is a diversion of resources into a speculative sphere concerning a technology that we don't know if will truly help to mitigate climate change or may bring about severe consequences for climate in the rest of the world. So, what the Mexican government will be doing in environmental terms is to point at the needs and properly address international funding, particularly in these aspects where loss and damages are happening as a result of climate change. We are considering people and nature first, which means we are centering our efforts to protect nature and environment. That's our priority. Instead of investing resources that could generate adverse consequences as some scientific studies have already shown in different parts of the world. It's very clear, thank you. I wanted to touch on the topic just now. You are aware that in late February, the UNEP published a report by an independent panel of experts called Atmosphere, which indicates, among other things, that given the numerous unknowns and risks surrounding solar radiation modification, it is crucial to establish an international process for scientific review to identify scenarios, consequences, uncertainties, and knowledge. The report also suggests that a governance process would be valuable to guide decisions regarding research activities, including laboratory-based research, small-scale outdoor experiments, and deployments of different solar radiation modification techniques. I don't know if you are aware, but Mexico co-sponsored the UNEA 4 resolution proposal on the governance of geoengineering in 2019, which was withdrawn due to a lack of consensus after a week of intense negotiations. In light of this, I wanted to ask if you could comment on Mexico's vision regarding the role of UNEA or UNEP at that time and what your vision would be today. I believe that this document recently released by UNEP Atmosphere is a good roadmap for what is happening globally. We need to strengthen governance from the outset in this matter, where companies or startups related to the use of this technology understand that there is a national framework of action, that there are rules, and that ultimately the world's climate is interconnected. For example, what can be done in Indonesia will have impacts in the United States, China, or Mexico. It is an interconnected and living planet, as some would say in terms of Gaia. Therefore, what we need is a greater number of scientific studies on the subject, a precautionary principle that considers the potential effects this technology may have on the lives of millions of people. Undoubtedly, one of humanity's great achievements was stopping the thinning of the ozone layer on this planet, which demonstrated international will in addressing a key issue. Opening up a space for this technology despite multiple studies indicating its potential to exacerbate thinning contradicts the previously achieved and successful international agreement which had instilled hope. If countries were able to come to an agreement in order to address the thinning of the ozone layer, we can certainly come to an agreement on how to tackle climate change. It is important, and I reiterate, not to view climate change as an opportunity for new, scientifically unproven technologies that may or may not serve their intended purpose. Instead, we need to focus resources on combating climate change through mitigation, encouraging companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and environmental education to reduce the prevailing consumerism of the current economic system. It is crucial to address the obsolescence created by digital and technological devices and the clothes and food that come from thousands of kilometers away, whose production methods are often unknown. We must reshape global consumption patterns by advocating for localized marketing and production channels, emphasizing shorter supply chains. And that's where resources should be allocated. If we change our consumption patterns, we will contribute significantly to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Additionally, we must invest in climate adaptation, as I mentioned earlier. We find the appeals of the group of island nations within the framework of the United Nations and COPs about the imminent disappearance of their countries deeply distressing. We need to take the necessary actions not only to safeguard the lives of these individuals, but also to preserve the surrounding environment that is slipping away from us. We must break away from the anthropocentric view that technology will save us from the same destruction we are causing to the planet through excessive energy use and fossil fuel related technologies. We as humans need to create a sense of community around nature. That is a necessary and urgent action. We need to reconnect with nature. And that's why it is important to generate agroecological practices like building more sustainable cities with zero emissions when it comes to build houses. And these are urgent tasks, and that's where we need to invest the resources in order to build a more sustainable model and avoid these speculative solutions that are mostly technocentric based, believing that technology will save us from the destruction we have created. We need to change our mentality, which means recognizing that the current model we are living in is not sustainable in the long term. And we need a new model for society. This model is already being built in many parts of the world. In Mexico, for example, we have very interesting experiences being carried out by collectives, associations, communal lands, and communities that are managing their land assets in a sustainable way. They are utilizing and conserving forests, caring for other living beings, and these practices are primarily initiated by indigenous communities. Mexico has the largest number of indigenous people in absolute terms in Latin America, and perhaps that's why we are working better in the southern and southeastern part of the country conserving natural resources compared to the northern part, which is more connected to the United States and unfortunately experiences significant environmental devastation and pollution of its rivers and air. The city of Monterrey, for example, has more days with unbreathable air than days with good air quality. We need to question this model and allocate resources to transform all these aspects to ensure long-term viability. Yes, there is definitely a lot of work that still needs to be done in this field, despite the decades of work that those of us involved in these processes have been doing. However, progress is slow, and precisely you were talking about what we refer to as moral hazard, the diversion of attention from the measures that need to be prioritized to address climate change and ensure that the sustainability of ecosystems and biodiversity, which are crucial for our survival. But there are also those who, in the face of this slow progress, become frustrated and consider research on this topic to be imperative. So it is obviously a complex debate that I don't want to mention here. Nevertheless, I wanted to ask you about it because the latest IPCC report highlights that the lack of formal and robust governance regarding solar radiation modification is a risk in itself. So, regardless of whether one is in favor or against the development of these technologies, we need to address the issue of governance in some way. In your opinion, What role could international organizations like the United Nations play in developing governance frameworks for solar radiation modification to address these risks? I believe that the United Nations has a relevant role to play in this regard. It has allowed us in recent decades to have an international framework that regulates how we act on the planet. So it's crucial to invest in the construction of governance where there are clear rules and where experimentation or the use of this technology is not allowed. It is very, very important that nations recognize the need to direct resources towards more urgent and necessary matters for the survival of the planet. The planet needs to be the priority and not the economic interest of large corporations around this matter. For the Mexican government, it's very clear that it is necessary to foster a research intended to provide solutions to the national problems we have in Mexico. It means a research that helps to tackle social injustices, climate inequality, and that we can make progress in terms of infrastructure and mobility. We need resources to address the ecological imbalances we are creating due to the economic system, which resulted in a pandemic like COVID-19 that unfortunately killed millions of people around the world. This pandemic is the result of an ecological imbalance caused by the intensive exploitation of natural resources. Therefore, to prevent future pandemics, we need to restore the balance of nature, and that's where resources from our countries need to be allocated. For example, I would be concerned if we were to reach ambiguous agreements for things like deep sea mining, where exploration is already starting in international waters. This is very serious because it involves intense exploitation that puts marine biodiversity and the oceans themselves at risks. The oceans, where oxygen is primarily generated, are crucial for our survival. We cannot allow economic interests to take precedence over the survival of the planet and our own survival. That's where our attention needs to be focused. We cannot think that if we exploit the oceans, it won't have an impact on these bodies of water. In this case, it's the same. If we engage in solar radiation exercises, it will undoubtedly have an impact. And it is not proven that it will actually help cool the planet, but it may create imbalances in the global climate. We are about to conclude, but I wanted to briefly revisit the issue of the risks posed by the governance gap regarding solar radiation modification. I wanted to ask if you consider that actions undertaken by the government of Mexico is a way to address these governance gaps. Certainly, I believe that national governments need to establish regulations to prevent themselves from becoming places for experimentation in solar radiation modification. We are a sovereign nation with strong economic capabilities that can take the opportunity to say no to this type of experimentation in terms of solar radiation modification, and that's why we need to put in place the necessary agreements with other nations, even if they don't have the same economic power or presence, so that they can also assert their sovereign right to refuse experimentation or use of these technologies. Therefore, it is within the framework of the United Nations and specifically the COP28 in the United Arab Emirates, where Mexico is fostering dialogue and expanding historically collaborative areas within the Mexican government. We are talking to countries in Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula, and we will continue to engage with them and take actions with African governments in the future as well. What were you asking about the COP? I was going to ask if the idea at COP is to hold bilateral meetings to discuss with different countries the need to work on a regulation and a governance of solar radiation modification. Is that correct? Yes. We will work at COP towards a joint declaration from various nations regarding solar engineering, and we will present it in the United Arab Emirates. We are discussing with other countries the need to regulate this. Hopefully, progress can also be made within the framework of the United Nations. Very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Ávila. And to conclude this interview, I would like to ask you a somewhat philosophical question, since the issue of climate change is not very encouraging. And you have described all the challenges and problems that Mexico and other countries face, the challenges for biodiversity and ecosystems. So, thinking about the magnitude of the challenges we face, how can the world hold onto hope without disregarding the seriousness of the situation? I believe that the world is doing many things. Public officials and governments are moving at a much slower pace than the people on the ground who are actually building things. So in the case of Mexico, we see it. I mean, the people who produce coffee for export to Europe or the United States are producing organic, sustainable coffee, taking care of nature, growing it in the shade, and taking care of the soil, which is the fundamental resource. So we extended the concept of crop diversification to coffee, vanilla, cocoa, and other important products in Mexico. We grow corn in Mexico, but we also grow corn associated with other crops like squash, chili, and beans. There is hope in how soil conservation and biodiversity are being supported. We conducted a study on the impact of the Sowing Life program around protected natural areas in our country. And this study was very interesting because the regeneration of nature in areas that were already impacted by destruction or livestock allowed the creation of biological corridors that connected protected natural areas. And as a result, we began observing the presence of various animals such as pumas and deer, utilizing these newly reforested areas as corridors to navigate and access the newly protected zones. So that is undoubtedly a significant achievement that people on the ground are accomplishing by creating spaces and engaging in different activities related to waste management. In the case of Mexico, we see many women leaders stepping up to defend their land. They confront various challenges such as the encroachment of extractive mining companies on their land, and they are stating their opposition to the presence or leading the fight in favor of life and ecology against industrial companies that have settled there. So I believe there is hope in the form of a society in motion that we see in Mexico. I have also had the opportunity to see it in Latin America, and what we need is to listen more to these people in order to develop public policies together, as there is a wealth of popular wisdom surrounding climate change. People realize which trees are being affected by pests, which animals are disappearing due to climate change. People are aware that certain crops can now grow at higher altitudes than before because climate has changed. And mosquitoes have arrived where there were no predators before. So people are taking action against climate change. They are caring for and planting trees in a different way. For example, in Michoacan, there is a community called San Jerónimo Purpechas, and they place water vessels for wildlife in their forest reserves and set up cameras to film them. It is interesting that the community itself presents all the images of wild animals captured drinking from the water they provided. But that community, for example, created artificial wetlands. Instead of investing in water treatment plants, they build wetlands, saving a lot of energy and sending crystal clear water to Lake Pátzcuaro, which is one of the most beautiful lakes in our country. It is a community organized by indigenous people who decided to do it. And then I can tell you thousands of experiences like this all over Mexico. It's up to us to give visibility to these experiences, learn from them, because that's where our hope lies. There are companies that destroy the planet, devastate it, but there is also a society that defends it, reclaims, controls its territory, and organizes in terms of consumption, production, and sustainability in many aspects. By learning from them, we can accomplish many things. I love this hopeful message to end this interview. Moving from the desk to the ground will be the message of hope. Thank you very much, Dr. Ávila, for this very interesting conversation. We want to wish you all the best in your work, and of course, you are welcome anytime for another interview. Thank you very much, Dr. Ávila.